Welcome to Lightroom Classic Develop Basics. So we're going to dive into the Develop module in this class. Like I was just telling some of you earlier, this is kind of a new class I put together from the full Lightroom workshop, and the next Monday we're going to kind of have an advanced version of this class and talk about some of the other tools in the Develop module. And we're going to talk about some of the organizational and presets and things like that in the Develop module as well. But let's kind of go over what that is. So the Develop module is just where all the editing is done on a photograph in Lightroom. So it's separate from the Library module. In the Library module, you can do some basic editing, but all it's doing is really moving the controls in the Develop module, which we're going to go over. So it lets you adjust things like exposure, color saturation, vibrancy. It lets you do sharpening and noise reduction, and even some lens calibration, distortion controls, and lots of other things too. So we're going to cover just some of the basic panels, make sure everybody really understands how to do these things. And honestly, you can do probably 90% of what you need to do with a photo with these controls here, and then some of the advanced tools you can get if you need to be a little bit more selective. But first, real quick, let's just take a look here. What you want to be is in this Develop module. So on the top right, if you select a photo and then click on Develop, that'll get you right over there. You can only view one photo at a time in the Develop module, so that's one thing that's a little bit different from the Library modules. You won't have a grid view. One thing about the Develop module too is you can't switch folders from the Develop module. So if you want to switch folders and get to a different set of pictures, you have to go back to the Library module. But as you'll see in a second, the Develop module does let you look at collections. So if you have photos in collections, then you will be able to switch to different sets of photos from the Library module. The other thing you're going to be able to do is use the film strip at the very bottom of the screen. So I'm going to bring up my live Lightroom here too, make sure everybody can see that as well. Everybody see that there? Mm-hmm. Okay. So if we click on any photo in here and we go to Develop, you'll notice on the left hand side we don't have any folders anymore, but we do have collections. So if you had used collections to organize some of your photos, then you would still be able to switch to different sets of photos. Now you can only view one photo at a time in the middle view, and we're going to talk about some of these other sections more in detail in a second. But you do have the film strip at the bottom, so whatever collection or folder you were in the library before you switched over to the Develop module, you can still see that set of photos down there. So you can still switch to different photos while you're in the Develop module. Okay, so just a little bit on navigation.
Quick question, Chris?
Yeah.
I don't know, it's off topic. I don't want to get on a rat hole. Can you give us a sentence or two on what collections do, because I don't use it?
Yeah, that's fine. So yeah, so real quick on that. So you probably mostly use folders, right? Okay, and folders are the primary organization. That's a representation of the folders on your computer and where those files are actually stored. Collections are like virtual galleries just inside Lightroom. Because the problem with folders, if you had 5 different folders with different sets of images in them, and you tried to, let's say you had 3 pictures from each one of those folders that you wanted to see together because they were just your best edits, for example. If you try and drag and drop those in between folders, you might have noticed it'll actually move those files, right? So that's what collections are for. I can create a collection and I can drag and drop pictures from any folder, you know, from one picture from 50 different folders or 10 pictures from each folder, and put them in a collection, and it doesn't actually move any of your files around. It just gives you a view, a gallery view, so you can see all those photos together. You could, quote, collect those together.
So is it fundamentally analogous to the tagging in Elements?
Probably. Yeah, I'm not as familiar with Elements, but probably, because it kind of creates like a virtual area where you can have a bunch of photos that show up under that tag, right? I know it's kind of like tagging in, I'm a little more familiar with, on the video editing side, Final Cut Pro 10, and they don't have any kind of folders or collections, but you can create a tag and you can assign that tag to a bunch of different clips or pictures, and then all those would show up under that tag. So you could kind of think of it like that. You just create a collection, you can call it anything you want, and then you can just drag and drop photos into it, and any of those photos that you drag into it will show up under that collection. But it's completely virtual. I can remove these photos or delete the collection. It won't actually affect any of my original files. They're still back up under the folder here.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And so when you're in develop, you can still see that collection. So I can switch to that collection, but now I can't switch back to that folder. So if you want to go back to folders, you always have to go back to library and click on a folder. And whatever folder or collection you are determines what this film strip's going to have down here. So that film strip is something that shows up in every single module in Lightroom, so that if you're not in the library module, you can still switch to a different picture as long as it's within that set or within that folder. So, okay. So I'm going to go back to the slideshow here. Okay. So let's go to the next one. Okay, so let's talk about the left-hand side. So one thing I always tell people in my Lightroom classes, so you might have heard it before if you took some of my other ones, but Lightroom typically, not always, but typically it's meant to be worked kind of from left to right and then top to bottom. Now, once you kind of get familiar with the develop module, you might not use the left-hand side as much. Most of the controls are on the right-hand side, but you definitely work top to bottom, and we'll talk about that in a second when we get to the right-hand side. But just to understand a little bit, let's talk about the left panel a little bit. So this is where you get to work with things like presets and snapshots and view your history and work with collections. So we already talked about the collections, so this is where you can see those collections if you do want to change to a different collection set. But it has a few more things on here. So let's dive into that a little bit more. Now, before I move to the next slide, I want to talk about the navigator real quick. So it's this little box here that shows a small preview of whatever picture we're on. So if I go back to Lightroom here, so here's the picture I'm working on in the middle. And then I've got a little preview of it up here in the top left. Everybody see that? Now, why do we have a preview when we can already see the full thing? It's really because this whole navigator, and it actually includes these little controls at the top, is so you can kind of control when you're zooming into a photo. So if I simply click on a photo, it goes to 100%. Now I can drag around that photo. But what if I'm trying to find something I don't know where I'm at? Now I can certainly zoom back out and zoom back in over here. But the navigator lets me actually click on the zoomed in box and drag that around. So if I want to find something quickly that way, I can do that. And it also gives me zoom controls. So by default, when we're looking at the whole thing, it's set to fit because it fits it into our window. Now you can think of this as two halves. The left two here, fit and fill, are this view where you're kind of zoomed out. Whenever you click, it goes to one of these two right-hand numbers. So the default is 1:1, which means 100%. So this is full size view. This is 100% of the pixels right here. Now, if I'm zoomed out, I can also switch it to fill, and it will just fill my screen. It really depends on your screen, but it basically fills it left and right. So I can only go up and down a little bit because it just filled it up a little bit. I usually recommend leaving that on fit. Now, when you zoom in, if you want to zoom in a little bit more or maybe a little bit less. Now, if you go beyond 1:1, if you zoom into 200, 300%, your pictures are going to start to kind of fall apart most of the time because you're looking at such detailed pixels. It'll look very pixelated. It's not a good way to necessarily check things all the time. But if you need to get a little bit closer, then you can go over here where it says 1:1, and to the right of that, you can change it. And I can go to half, so now it's at 50%. Or I can click these arrows and I can go 2:1, which is now 200%. You can kind of see how pixelated that starts to get. And I can keep going down. I can do 300%, all the way down to 800%. So I think it's more useful if you want to do more like instead of 100%, maybe 50%, things like that. But make sure and always switch it back, because if I leave that at 50% and I zoom back out to fit, now when I zoom back in, it always goes back to 50% instead of 100%, unless I go back and click it back to 1:1. Okay, any questions on that? That makes sense with the navigator? Okay. Cool. So I just like to make sure people understand that before I go on here. So let's take a look at some of the other items on the left-hand panel. The first one is presets, and this will make a little bit more sense once we get into actually some of the developed sliders when we're changing exposure and things like that. But presets are simply a collection of saved developed settings. So when we get to the right-hand side, we're going to be changing a bunch of sliders up and down and changing the way our picture looks. You can then save how those are set at that time into a preset. You can call it anything you want. And then later on, you can click on that preset and it will reapply any of those settings that you saved into that preset. Now there's a lot of presets that are built in and come with Lightroom Classic from Adobe, and you can certainly play with those. They have them categorized under like black and white and color and things like that. And there's some special ones like sepia or other special effects, fun color toning and stuff like that too. But if you had like a bunch of settings that you tended to apply to most of your pictures, or you wanted to apply a whole bunch of them to a whole bunch of pictures for the same set, so they all kind of have the same look, then you could use presets. You could edit one picture, you could save all those settings to a preset, and then you simply click on the other pictures and click on that preset and it'll apply those settings over there. Okay, so that's pretty simple. I'll show you that once we kind of get started actually editing a little bit. We'll demonstrate that. So the next one we have are called snapshots. And this also is very similar to history, which we're going to talk about next. So snapshots are created by you, and it's basically like a history of everything you've done to a photo, but that you control. So the history just keeps track of everything you've ever done to a photo. But it's a little different than presets, but in a way it works the same in that you can edit a photo however you want. You've changed a bunch of sliders, and then you can create a snapshot of that picture, and it will save the current state of that image with any changes you've made, any developed changes you've made. And you can name it whatever you want, and it'll put it in a list on the left-hand side in alphabetical order. So let's say I make a bunch of edits to a version in color, and I save that as color version 1, and then I change it to black and white, and I play with it that way, and I make it more contrasty and make it darker blacks and brighter whites and all this kind of stuff, and change that to monochrome version 1, and then save those both as snapshots. Now I can click on each one of those snapshots, whether the color one or the monochrome one, and it will switch the picture back and forth. Now the difference between snapshots and presets is a snapshot is per picture. So these snapshots are only saved on that specific picture you're currently working on. You click on a different picture, it's going to have a different set of snapshots, or they'll all go away if you've never created any snapshots. So it's really for creating, in a way, different edit versions of that one picture. So you can flip back and forth or go to different points in time, you could say, because maybe you just want to try something out after you've kind of got it where you want it. You save that snapshot, and then you play with it some more and decide you don't like it, so you go click on that snapshot and go back to where you were. Okay, so that makes sense? So pretty simple, just a way to kind of save this, another way to save the state of an image. Whereas presets are global, so when you save a preset, you can see it from any image you're working on. What was that? Okay, I thought somebody's...
One question.
Yeah.
So you use Snapshot to save your edits for exporting?
No, you don't have to. This is more something, a set of edits you might want to go back to. Lightroom will keep track of any edits as you're doing them. There's no need to actually save anything, but it saves everything in real time. So the nice thing about a snapshot is if you're making changes, it's always saving those. So if you want to keep it sort of where it's at right now, you kind of like how it looks, then you could save a snapshot and just name it whatever you want, like, best edit version 1. And then you could still play with it and you could make a bunch of changes, but this lets you just go back to whatever you had it to before. Does that make sense? Yeah, I'll show you. I'll show you live in a little bit. So it's kind of like a history that you have more control over. And we'll talk about history next. So you'll see history over here. It's actually on the left-hand side of your Lightroom screen, but it's right below the snapshots panel. Now, history is created automatically by Lightroom, and it literally records everything in here that you do to a photo, whether everything from import to every single little change you might do. It adds a new entry. And you can't really control the order of these. It always shows them in chronological order. So it's your history of time. So you can always use history, and you can click back in time as well. And you can go back to a certain time when you had it edited a different way. But snapshots give you a named way to bring back a whole bunch of settings if you need to go back to those. On newer versions of Lightroom Classic, if you just hover your mouse over any one of these, it will actually show you a preview of what it looked like at that time up in the navigation pane, or the navigator. And if you click on it, it will go back in time to how it was before you made all the changes after that. So but you can see here, it even recorded when I exported it, when I imported it, every single little change, it adds in there. And you can always click the X right here, and you can actually clear the whole history, but then you can't go back in time. And you can also reset any picture though too, because keep in mind that Lightroom is non-destructive, so it's never actually saving these changes into your file. It's just keeping track of them as they go, and that's kind of what the history is in a way.
Question.
Yeah.
Have you found that long histories on a large number of pictures tends to affect performance? I read a couple of references to that, and I think I've seen it myself as well.
Yes.
Is there any value in purging that every once in a while, or do you have any recommendations there?
Yeah, I would actually agree with that. I have seen that. If you have a lot of photos and then you have a lot of history and a lot of photos, Lightroom has gotten better about it. I used to keep all of my photos in different catalogs that I had to flip through for each year because I didn't want too many pictures in one database, because Lightroom would slow down. I tend to keep everything in one catalog now because Lightroom has gotten a lot better about that. But that is one thing that can help bring performance back for sure, is clearing the history. So clearing the history usually won't actually clear any of the edits you currently have on it. It just means you can't go back in history to something else. It won't really reset the photo. You can reset a photo still too, but you'll keep your edits if you want to clear the history on a bunch of them. So that is definitely a valid thing you can do to help performance.
How do you go about clearing history for a selected group of photos?
I'm pretty sure you can select a whole bunch at once and do that. I don't think you can.
It won't change the photo itself?
No, so I mean, we'll get into some of these sliders in a second, but if I actually go and like change a bunch of sliders, see the history tab on the left-hand side right here? Every time I change a slider, it adds an entry. So I'm not really doing anything good to the photo. I'm just changing sliders so we can kind of see how that changes. So you can kind of see everything it did. Now I can reset a photo back to default, and that's just a new history entry. Okay, now if we go.
How did you do default?
So you hit the reset button in the lower right.
Oh, okay.
So right here.
Yeah.
And it'll actually add that to the history there. So now the only thing about develop is you can't really select multiple photos because it really only lets you work on one photo at a time. So it's something where you'd have to go back to library. And I'm going to see here.
If this is off topic, we can skip it.
Yeah, no, it's fine. Let me take a look because I'm pretty sure you can go right here, because you can always go to develop settings and you can reset all of them. But I was just trying to see, I don't think you can clear history on. I'll find out and I'll let you know for sure, because I know how you can do. You can definitely do it with each individual photo. I'm not quite sure if you can do it on all of them. So I'll find out. I'll find out and let you know though.
Thanks.
So yeah, I'm not seeing a, okay. I'll see if that's possible. But otherwise what you do, oh, where did my Lightroom go? Well, let's see if it'll let us do it this way. Yeah, see, that only cleared it one at a time still, even though I've got multiple selected. Because you can still only see one at a time. But normally you just hit clear all right here.
Okay.
And see, now the history's gone. Now that doesn't matter if I reset it or not. So let's just show, like, if we edit this photo a little bit. Okay, so I've got a bunch of history. Now if I clear the history, it's still edited. I didn't change any of my sliders over here. So it doesn't clear your edits. So that's why it's okay to clear the history, and it just gives, it purges some of the information that Lightroom has to keep track of there in the database. So if we hit reset now, that will reset it, and that goes in the history now. But we don't have any other history, and we can clear that. So no, that's definitely a good question, and that is something that I will do once in a while.
So Chris, I just want to confirm.
Yeah.
I think I saw that when you do the edits, you're happy with it the way it is, and you go back into history, and then you do that delete at the top, then everything goes away as far as the history is concerned, but it remains at that last edit.
Exactly, yeah. All these sliders will still be kept track of and stay the same in where you had it edited. Unless you actually hit reset, it won't change any of those.
Okay, so then again, I'm sorry if I'm taking us off topic, but
That's okay.
the other day we were doing stuff with Lightroom, and you had, or somebody had mentioned about periodically taking the metadata from a photograph and saving it, so that if it's at the edit that you like, whatever, you can save it somewhere so that the metadata will stay with that photo.
Right. So that's if you're switching between, if you're switching the same photo between maybe Lightroom and another program, if that program will read the metadata right, or if you're going between Lightroom on two different computers or between two different catalogs. Because any of these sliders I'm changing in Lightroom, it's only being kept track of in Lightroom. So if I just took this file to another computer and opened it, none of these edits are going to be there. It's just going to read the straight raw file, and you're not going to have any of your edits. So, and that can happen too if you lose your catalog file, or if you make a new catalog file and add these photos back into it, it won't necessarily have all these edits because these are just kept track of in the current catalog that I'm in. So if you want to kind of save your edits, you can still always reset a file. It doesn't actually save the edits into the file. And you have to do it from the library module, and you can do it on an individual photo or a whole folder. But if you right click on any photo and go to metadata and save metadata to file, it will actually then sort of save these edits alongside the file in a standard way, so that if you then had to open this photo up in another Lightroom on a different computer, you'd have to make sure and bring that extra file with it. If it had the extra file with the metadata, then it would grab all your edits. So I do that. I do that as well, because if I've edited a whole bunch of these photos, I'm going to right click on that folder every once in a while and hit save metadata, and it's going to save all the stuff I've done to all these files.
And you do that, didn't you? Didn't we have kind of a mini discussion on the fact that you do that periodically? Or
Yeah, I do that periodically, especially on the ones I've edited. So a lot of times I'll filter by just the ones that I've edited and then just save the metadata to those, just in case anything ever happened to my my catalog. Or I used to go between different catalogs more, so it was more important because I wanted to make sure that I didn't lose any edits. But it can be it can definitely save you. A long time ago I had a catalog I lost before I knew about this, and I lost all my edits. And not just your edits, any kind of color coding or any organization you've done too. So if you flagged anything, stuff like that. So yeah, that's definitely something that's good to do.
Okay, thanks for going over that again.
Yeah.
So to follow up on that a little bit, did I hear just now that if you do that, it gives you the ability to use different platforms to edit the same photo? For instance, if you're commuting back and forth to work and you're using your iPad versus your desktop?
Possibly. I mean, if you're synchronizing through Lightroom, it shouldn't be a big deal anyways. It should synchronize any edits you've done. It's more for if I opened this file on a completely different computer, so I copied it over there with a USB drive or something like that and opened it in Lightroom over there, or if I opened this outside of Lightroom into like Photoshop, it should be able to pick up the Lightroom edits in Photo Raw, and you wouldn't have to start over necessarily. It really depends on certain other programs like Luminar if they'll actually read that metadata. It's standard metadata. Every editing program should read it, but I've run into sometimes certain ones won't because they want to use their own. It's more just a safety bet. So if anything happened to your Lightroom catalog and you had to create a new catalog and import all your stuff back in, you'd import all your stuff back in with all the same edits and color coding or flagging or rating and stuff like that.
Okay, last question before I let you return to your main thread here.
Yeah.
I noticed that after you delete the history, you can still do a reset. Does that mean that
Yep.
all those edits, in fact, are being saved as metadata on the file itself? That's how you can do that anyway?
They're still never really saved directly into the file. They're just a set of information that Lightroom can use to read the edits you've done the last time you saved the metadata. You can always still reset a raw file. This is especially with raw files. You can always reset a raw file back. Now, if you'd want to save that metadata again, because otherwise that metadata is basically saying that it's edited, but it's not actually changing any of the original information in the picture. It's just it's like a sidecar information that lets Lightroom and some other programs like Photoshop know what you've edited in Lightroom.
Where does it put it? Is that in the catalog or is it out in the folder?
It's actually next to the file. I mean, it depends on what kind of raw file you have. I've got a DNG file here, so if you have a standard raw file from your camera, like a Nikon NEF file or a Canon CR2 file or a Fujifilm RAF file, it will never actually save anything to that file. So you'll actually get a second file that's the same name as your image. So in this case, like DSC0104, but it'll say .xml, which is just for the metadata. And so you have to make sure and copy both those files. So I usually, it's safe because you can usually just copy the whole folder if you're copying something over, but that sidecar file is what actually contains the metadata information that Lightroom would use to pull the edits out. If you convert your raw files to a DNG file, which is kind of Adobe's open source raw file, those files support storing that metadata inside the DNG. It's still not actually affecting the raw file inside the DNG. There's two separate spots in there, but it just means that you have one file that you can copy back and forth, and it will include that metadata inside that file.
Got it.
So it's still resettable and everything. It's just you don't get two files, but otherwise you'll see two files like that.
So, whoops. Just one more thing on that, Ben.
Yeah.
Is it best to have your photos in DNG rather than the NEF? Then?
You can still use NEF. You're just going to get a secondary file along with it. You'll see in the folder.
But in the DNG, it goes into it.
Right. So you're not going to see that second file here because it's able to save it inside the DNG. The raw file is inside the DNG too. They're in separate spaces inside of there. Think of it almost like a container file.
Right. It looks like all of your folder or photos there are DNG. So when you copied them onto from your camera or wherever your SD card into Lightroom, did you copy them as DNGs rather than NEFs?
Not always. These are just a specific set I did for the classes, and these ones I changed to DNG after the fact. I do use DNG a lot because a lot of times they can be up to 20% smaller than an original raw file, and from what I've seen, I haven't really seen any detrimental effect or any loss of quality. Sometimes I'll import my original RAWs, I'll work off of those and kind of have my edits done and everything, and then later on, especially archived ones, I'll convert them all to DNG just to save space and keep from having those second files everywhere and stuff like that. I am using them more and more though, because they could potentially be more compatible in the future, although I think we'll still have access to stuff that can open our original RAWs for a while. But I like them. You also have the new thing called enhanced details in Lightroom, which will actually create a copy of your raw file. It'll make a DNG copy of your raw file called an enhanced details file, which is actually a little bit higher quality version of even just a regular DNG. That takes a bit of processing power to do on a lot of photos though. But that's another way to get DNGs as well. And sometimes I will do that, especially with Fujifilm RAW files, because Adobe's been notoriously bad at translating Fujifilm RAW files because of the different color array they have. They've actually gotten it a lot better recently, but the enhanced DNG version of specifically those Fujifilm RAW files are definitely a lot better than their original translations. So with Fuji RAW files, a lot of times I will convert all of those to enhanced DNGs, at least all the ones I'm going to work on. So.
And when do you do that? Do you do it right before you start developing?
Yeah, you could do them all at once if you know that you want that, or you can just do it on a picture before you. I would do it before you start working on it. And,
oh, I see. Before you start working with it.
Yep, and then work off of the enhanced one. And I'll honestly usually just delete the original one at that point if I'm happy with everything looks, because the enhanced DNGs are not smaller files. Regular DNGs tend to be smaller than a regular raw file from your camera, so they can save you space, but an enhanced DNG is usually larger. So I only do it sometimes if I really need to. Although, like I said, sometimes on the Fuji ones I'll convert each one because, I've got a pretty decent external hard drive that's brand new I just got, and I've got tons of space on there, so I'm not too worried about that.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, so let's see. So everybody pretty good with history, though. It just kind of gives you a chronological time with that. So the middle panel, what's that?
Yep.
Okay. So the middle panel we'll go over real quick. This is very simply where you see your image. It's loop view, just like in the library module. You can view one image at a time. You can zoom in and out like we talked about. The bottom bar down here is your toolbar, and that's where you're going to have a lot of controls that you can have very similar to the library module. So you've got like your color coding, your star ratings, you have your left and right. Don't worry about soft proofing, that has to do with printing. And you can customize it using all these here. So you can turn things on and off that would be on here. Now, one thing to keep in mind about the toolbar in the develop module is it keeps track of these separately from the library module. So if you are in the library module and you've turned a bunch of these controls on or off, and then you go to the develop module and it looks different, it's because you can turn these on or off in the develop module independently. So it will keep track of those separately. So you can change what you have on there. If you don't want to see the color coding in the develop module, things like that, then you don't have to. So, okay, let's take a look at the right panels. This is where we really kind of get into the meat of things here. This is where we do most of our actual editing, applying corrections, cropping, etc. So here's some of the panels that we're going to talk about in the basics class. We'll go over the histogram real quick, but we're mostly going to talk about the tool strip, especially the crop tool. The spot removal and some of the other tools there are more for the advanced class. We'll talk about the crop tool, the basics panel, especially the detail panel for adjusting sharpening. We'll talk a little bit about lens correction, and if we have time, we'll get into some of the effects, which is actually very simple. It's just kind of some fun things you can do. But first, let's talk a little bit real quick about the histogram. A histogram is basically just a graph. It's a graphical representation of your tonal values, red, green, and blue, and some other colors in there. It'll mix them. And it just shows the amount of tones of a particular brightness that you have in your photo. Ranging, and I'm going to show you a picture of it in a second, but ranging from the left, it goes left to right. On the very far left, we have completely black. So a pure black pixel would be 0% brightness on your monitor. On the far right, we would have completely 100% white, which is 100% bright pixel, so pure white pixel. And so on the top right here of the screen, that's basically what a histogram looks like. It's a graph here. And so this left bar would be pure black, the left right would be pure white, and then we have our highlights right about here, we have our shadows right about here, and then we have all of our midtones in here. Okay, so a histogram doesn't always necessarily mean that your picture is correct. There's not like a correct histogram for every picture, because this is an art form too, and sometimes you might want certain areas too bright so that other things are fine, or you might want certain areas blacked out and too dark because it gives you some contrast, and you have other areas lit. But one thing you can use a histogram for is trying to collect as much information as possible. So if you have more of your picture in these middle areas, then you have more information to work with when you're editing your photo. You don't want things typically all the way to the left or all the way to the right sometimes, because that means that things are either blown out white or blacked out, completely underexposed, and you don't have any information if you go too far to the left or to the right. So sometimes you can use a histogram if you're trying to keep things towards the middle, and some cameras will show you this live in there. You can see it after you've taken a picture. So in Lightroom, it's just kind of showing you after you've taken it kind of where these tonal values lie. So we've got kind of a pretty broad spectrum in this histogram here, with a little bit more here to the right, and we've got some blue, which means we've got some brighter blue areas. Maybe that's some sky. It doesn't necessarily tell you exactly what's in there though. It's just showing you brightness across your image. If you had a big mountain in the middle, that would mean you have a brighter midtone section and not so many darks and not so many highlights. So then real quick in the histogram, you do have red, green, and blue are the primary colors in there. But you do have gray when all three colors overlap. And then you do have some yellow and other colors in there, magenta, cyan, when you have different colors overlapping. So don't worry about trying to memorize this too much. It's just so you kind of understand what you're seeing there. So yellow would be red and green, magenta is red and blue, and cyan is green and blue if those overlap. Okay? I don't typically worry about that too much. I'm more watching for exposure, how dark or bright things are getting, or where things are in the midtones. Okay. So now looking at the right-hand panel, remember one thing we want to do is we kind of start from the top and go to the bottom. Now you don't have to start at the top with the crop overlay tool necessarily. There are certain tools where we definitely want to go from top to bottom. So if you kind of know the cropping of your picture and you want to do that first, this can be a good way to kind of get it all set and get things straightened out and make sure that while you're working on the picture, it's kind of the crop that you want to see in the end. It also lets you do some straightening of the photo too if it's not quite level. So if you're able to follow along, look in the top right, you're going to see that little square here. And if you click on it, you're going to get this section down here in the second picture. Okay? And it's going to have a few different controls in here we're going to talk about. One tip though is if you press the X key, so after you click on this, it's going to show you a little crop tool around your picture. And if you have a horizontal picture or a vertical picture and you want to switch your crop between horizontal and vertical, you can just hit X and it will switch between that. So let me show you that. If we click on this crop tool right here, it brings up a new little panel here, and we'll go over these controls here in a second. But you can see it gave us a new kind of cropping panel over our picture. Now if I just press the X key, it switches to a vertical crop or back to a horizontal crop, and I can always hit reset to get it back out to the whole picture. But if I was simply trying to switch this to a vertical picture and then I could kind of crop it how I wanted to there, then I can just hit X to go vertical and then go back and then kind of crop it how I want. So I'm going to reset that one for now, and let's talk about some of the controls and then we'll kind of go back to the live view here. So if we look at some of the controls, so in this second picture down here in this crop area, the first one is aspect ratio, and I like to talk about this a little bit. It's especially important for printing. It's not as big a deal if you're going online, unless you're going to certain specific services. Instagram, for example, likes certain aspect ratios. But these basically let you lock your cropping area to a specific size, such as 8x10 or 5x7, etc. So if you know you're going to be printing on 8x10 paper or a 5x7 or a 13x19, then you want to set this aspect ratio to one of those sizes, so it will then crop your image, and then you know when you print it out it's already cropped correctly for that paper size. And an aspect ratio is simply what it is. It's simply what it says, a ratio. It's a proportional relationship between an image's width and height. It basically just describes the image's shape, which in this case is usually a rectangle or a square or something like that. And they're written as a formula, width to height, like this, so 3:2. And so an example of this is, it's easiest to think about it with a square, which would have an aspect ratio of 1:1, so all the sides are equal. You don't have a side longer than the other. It does not tell you how many pixels are on a side, it just tells you it's square in this case. So it could be 500 by 500 pixels or 1500 by 1500. That's still a 1:1 ratio. It still gives you a square at any of those sizes. So it does not really change your resolution necessarily. It doesn't affect the pixels except for what you cut out with the crop. The aspect ratio is just telling us the shape of that rectangle, so the size of that paper or the size we need for Instagram, things like that. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah, question for you.
Yeah.
This is probably off topic, and if it doesn't make sense to talk about it, please say so. But I seem to recall reading somewhere that the human eye can start figuring out pixelation at about 150 DPI or 220, somewhere in there, before you can start seeing some degradation. Is in fact, are those numbers correct? And does aspect ratio play into any of this in your experience?
The aspect ratio wouldn't play into that so much. When you're actually exporting or printing the photo, then you can actually pick the pixel or the dot density, so the DPI. This is more just defining the shape, the rectangular shape that you're going to crop your picture. So it doesn't really determine the DPI you're going to do until you actually print it or export it, because you could be cropping a 50 megapixel picture or a 10 megapixel picture. The crop tool doesn't really care about that. It's just more how you're defining the shape, whether you want a square crop or a rectangular crop, and what type of rectangle really.
I understand. Let me see if I can ask the question a little bit differently. Do you have any rules of thumb or guidance for any minimal sizes of pixels, be it height or width, based on what you're going to do about it? It's probably not the right place to ask this question, but if there is something like that, if you're going to print it at a certain size, don't do anything less than that, or if you're going to display it on a web page, you know, nothing, something like that. I get, as I'm hearing myself talk, I get that this is off topic, but if there is something that's a rule of thumb out there, I'd love to know about it at some point.
Yeah. Well, real quickly, I mean, part of the hard part with that is it's I think anyways, it's kind of hard to just define off the bat because you also have to look at viewing distance and things like that as well. So there are print calculators which will help you figure out what DPI you can even get to for certain sizes depending on the actual megapixels of your image. So I would always use a print calculator to figure out the size of the image I need to do and then the resolution of the image I actually have on the computer. And so, you know, if I'm printing 13 by 19 and I have a 10 megapixel image, it would actually tell me if I can do that or at what DPI I would be able to do that. So maybe with a 10 megapixel image at 13 by 19, I'd only be able to do 75 DPI. Now, the DPI, the resolution thing with the human eye is it really depends on viewing distance. There is probably a certain level where you're not going to be able to tell too much of a difference, but for example, with like a billboard that's meant to be seen from the freeway, you know, maybe 50 to 100 feet away or longer, some of those things are printed at very low DPI, like 25 to 75 DPI. Whereas if you looked at that really close, you're going to see pixelation that's going to look really bad. Whereas if you're printing like an 8 by 10 that people are going to be getting within a foot from, then you probably want to be somewhere in like the 200 to 300 DPI range to be able to make sure you're not seeing pixelation. I'd probably try and go for 300 if I could. So does that kind of answer the question?
It does. I'm feeling bad because you're right, because I was correct that this is not really on topic, but this is something I'll look at offline. Thank you.
Yeah, and email me and I can kind of talk to you about some of the calculators and things like that. I think a lot of it kind of has to do with viewing distance, and I have to kind of see some different, there might be some different, you know, advice for different viewing distances depending on the size you're going. But
okay, thank you.
So
Sorry.
yeah, no, that's fine. So just real quick, a quick demonstration of the crop tool. So that's what brings it up there. So you can drag any of the corners to crop your image, and it will keep it the same aspect ratio that you've defined. Now, if you go out a little bit more, you can rotate the image, and I'll show you this a little slower here in a second. Now, you can also straighten an image. You have a tool here. You can draw a line across something that should be level, and it will level your image based on that. And then this is where you now change your actual cropping or your aspect ratio. And it will define that cropping rectangle. You can always reset because remember this is non-destructive. And then when you're done, you can just hit close. So before we get into the basics panel, let me just show you that again. So if we click on the cropping tool right here, then we can simply drag the corners here. And as long as, so let me explain, there's this little lock icon right here. So if that is locked, that means that it will always keep your aspect ratio when you're dragging. So I can't just freely change this rectangle. It's going to keep it that same rectangle shape. So for example, if I click on this little section here, this is where I change my aspect ratio. So if I'm printing on 8 by 10 paper, they already have that built into there. 4 by 5 and 8 by 10 are the same. So I do that. Let me reset it. If I do 8 by 10, that's what an 8 by 10 piece of paper would look like. So I can't use my whole image. But now I can crop it over like this. But now I can actually go and I can drag the crop, and it's going to keep it the right aspect ratio or the right rectangle shape for 8 by 10 paper. So I can crop my image for printing on 8 by 10. Sometimes you can be limited because of the size of the paper. So that will let you do that. And as long as this is locked, it will keep that rectangle the right size. Now if I unlock this, then this aspect ratio doesn't mean a thing because now I can just freely change it however I want. Now if you're just going online like Facebook or to an online gallery or something that doesn't really matter too much, then you can just crop it however you want. Just know that it might not print correctly, or it might not print to a standard piece of paper, whether it's 5 by 7 or 8 by 10 or whatever. So you can always freeform as well. So I'm going to reset it though. And by default it's locked at original, which is just whatever it came out of your camera as. Now you can always enter custom. Now the numbers don't really matter as long as they give you the right aspect ratio. So it's easiest just to type in the size of like the paper, for example. So if it's 13 by 19, you just type in 13 by 19. We're not really doing inches here, but that would still give us the right aspect ratio, and hit OK. And it's going to crop it for 13 by 19 paper. And since I have it locked, I can now resize this, and I know it's going to fit onto 13 by 19 paper. And you just drag in the middle here to drag your cropped area around if you need to adjust it that way too. And if I hit done, it gives me the new cropped picture. Now again, Lightroom is non-destructive, so I can always click the crop tool again, and all my original stuff is still there, and I can always hit reset. Now the other thing you can do, I'm going to switch to a different picture for this, that's really handy to understand. Let me see, where is that one? Here we go. So is you can level a photo. So if you open the crop tool, so I can click on this corner. If I move out a little further, it changes to a little bit different arrow, and I can click, and now I can rotate. And if the aspect ratio is locked, it will still keep that aspect ratio, but now I can rotate it how I want. So now I can eyeball it, and I can kind of level it based on like this line here. Or it gives me some other tools. So you have your angle tool here, so I can grab this and rotate it as well, but that's a little heavier handed. It's kind of harder to do smaller movements. But if we click on this little guy here, so I click on it, it changes my cursor to this little level tool, and now I can drag along a line that should be level and kind of line it up as best you can, and it will level your photo based off of that line. And you can do this on a vertical object as well, but it might not mean that it levels anything horizontally. So if I wanted to drag along like this tree, I could do that as well, and it will make that tree straight up and down. But you can see that tree wasn't really straight up and down, so now everything else is skewed. So you got to be careful with that one. I usually use it for horizontal lines more than anything else. So, but that's how you crop and kind of level your image there. Okay, so let's go down to the next panel down below that toolbar is the basic panel. And this is where we really get into changing our photo. So we have a few different sections in here, and then we're going to talk about all those. And remember, we're going to try and do this from top down. It has a few different sections here, though. The first one is treatment. Treatment gives you a quick way of converting between color and black and white. So that's the very top. And that's usually something you want to do first. You can always reset this, but if you know you want to work in a black and white, then you want to change it to black and white first typically, because then as you change these sliders, it will do different things. If you know you're going to work in color, then you can do that. Now, using presets and snapshots, you can always save a version black and white or color and then play with them separately, and you can always change things back. So, but that's kind of a place to start. Then below that we have our profiles, which is a little bit of a newer thing that they've streamlined in Lightroom Classic. They've been around for a long time, but they really streamlined how it works. Now, I definitely recommend doing this first before you do anything else if you're going to change it. You know, play with these. If you decide you're not going to change them at all, then that's fine. But the biggest thing is you don't want to go and do a whole bunch of editing to your photo and then change to a different profile, because the profile in a way can change the way that it's sort of translating your raw file in the beginning, how it translates the color and contrast and things like that. So if you make a whole bunch of edits and then you change to a different profile, all those edits that you did might not work anymore. They might be over the top or too subtle because it changed the basic profile, which might have already added contrast or reduced contrast and things like that. So it could really mess with the picture. So I usually will pick a profile first if I'm going to change it. Otherwise, there's nothing wrong with just leaving it the default Adobe color and going from there. And then the next one is white balance, which is where we set our white balance. We're probably familiar with our cameras, but we can set our Kelvin. If it's a raw file, you can actually set your Kelvin. You can actually go up this scale, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000, or down lower, 3,200. If it's a JPEG file, you won't have a scale like this. It'll just give you a plus or minus 100, but you can still change your white balance. But this gives us our cool to our warm temperatures, and our tint, our greens and magentas. And you do have some presets. You can set it as shot or to daylight or to shade or to flash and things like that. And then you have a dropper tool, which I can demonstrate a little bit more. But if you had something in your photo that was white or gray that you wanted to try and set your white balance off of, you can click that tool and then click on your photo where that is, and it should set your white balance off of that object. If it's an accurate enough object, it should be okay. But you can always fine tune it with the sliders. So let's talk about profiles real quick. Profiles are now at the very top of the basics panel. They used to be down hidden somewhere, and it really is important to do them first if you're going to use them. So if you click on it, you'll see these other ones in here. Adobe Color is the default, but you also have Landscape, Portrait, Standard, Vivid, and Monochrome. So if you switch it to like Vivid, all your colors are going to get brighter. So if you had edited everything in the color profile and you made everything brighter and more saturated, more vivid colors, and then you switch to the vivid profile, it's going to make everything even more vivid, and it's probably not going to look very good. So that's why it's important to sometimes do these first and play with them first. They also have a new thing called a profile browser, and when you click on the browser, it will give you a whole bunch of other profiles. And the biggest thing is it gives you these things called camera matching profiles that will simulate the same profiles you'll see in your own camera, so such as landscape or portrait, etc. So in your own camera, Nikon, Canon, Fujifilm, things like that, there are color profiles built in there typically. Nikon and Canon typically have things like landscape and neutral and portrait and maybe vivid. Fujifilm has them named after old film types like Velvia and things like that. And Adobe duplicated those in Lightroom Classic. So if you go into the camera matching profiles, you'll actually see the same profiles your camera would have. So if you have a certain profile you like in your camera, that's what's nice about that. I'm going to kind of show this here while I talk about it. So there's the other profiles. Now watch the photo here. It will actually change subtly as we change it to each one. Sometimes it's pretty subtle, but you get slightly different translation of colors and contrast and things like that. And if we go to the browser, so I had a Fujifilm camera here, and as you'll see, all the different film simulations is what Fuji calls them, or camera profiles is what would match a Nikon or a Canon, and just moving your mouse over each one will show you what each one looks like. So it's good to start with these a lot of times, because if you start with something more vivid, then you don't have to play with the saturation slider later. It might be already where you want it, or maybe a certain monochrome or a certain contrast level. And then you simply close it once it's selected and you're good. And then you'd move on down to the next section like white balance. Okay, so any questions on those before we move on down to the rest of the basics panel? Okay, so and we'll kind of go over this live too, but let's go over some of these settings here real quick. So in the basics panel is the main place we're going to be doing our editing. And we have exposure, which adjusts the overall brightness, the contrast, which adjusts the overall contrast. Now contrast just means the difference between the lights and the darks of our image. So when we increase contrast, the darker areas get darker and the lighter areas get brighter. So you could actually overexpose or underexpose something by changing this slider. If you decrease contrast, then you do the opposite. You lighten up the darker areas and you darken down the lighter areas and you bring them closer together in line. The highlights adjust just the bright areas of the image, making them darker or lighter, and the shadows adjust just the darker areas of the image. And then you have the whites and the blacks. So the whites and the blacks adjust the very edges of that histogram. So the whites adjust the far right or the brightest areas of white, and they really are adjusting clipping. The blacks will adjust the very darkest black clipping. When we say clipping, this is especially important with printing. Clipping means whether or not that pixel is blown out, overexposed, or blacked out, underexposed. So if we're adjusting the white clipping, we're taking all of those pixels that might be blown out white and we're trying to maybe bring those down so that they're not quite overexposed anymore. Or maybe we're trying to bring things up so that they are a little bit towards pure white. Same with the blacks. We're adjusting things down towards a pure black pixel or up away from being a pure black underexposed pixel. So the nice thing about this is for printing, the black slider, I think, is something you can play with a little bit more, but the whites can be adjusted for printing, because if you have an area in your picture that is pure blown out white pixels and you print, it might be an area on the paper where the printer will not put any ink down at all because there's no information there. And you think that would be fine because it's white paper, but you can sometimes actually tell a difference, and you'll see a splotch that you can tell where there's no ink down at all, even if it is a white area. So you usually want some detail there. So you can use the white clipping to kind of bring that back down a little bit if possible. The black slider is not as big a deal because sometimes there are areas in my photo I don't mind if it goes to pure black pixels. It can add a little bit more contrast, and with digital photography sometimes it's harder to get pure blacks once in a while. And if you have a pure black pixel, the printer is still going to put down black ink, so you're going to be fine. Okay, so then the next section down, before we kind of go through all of these, is kind of our presence section, and this is where we have a few things like texture, clarity, and dehaze. Texture is a little bit newer feature, although it's been around for a little bit now. But it basically lets you smooth or accentuate details such as skin, bark, and hair with this texture slider. It's kind of a smart slider. It actually looks at textures in a photo and it tries to adjust them without destroying things. For example, you can reduce the texture on skin and it will smooth the skin out, but it tries to retain the fine pore details. So it still kind of looks natural looking without just smoothing everything over and making it look plastic. If you increase the texture on something such as bark or hair, it will actually bring out the detail in areas like that. Even sometimes like the out of focus areas, it shouldn't affect. So it does not change the color or tonality in your photograph though. It just tries to take a look at accentuating or de-accentuating textures. So then there's clarity. So clarity can almost act like the texture slider. It increases contrast or decreases contrast in the middle tones. So it kind of ignores those brighter or darker areas in your photo. Whereas contrast itself does everything. Clarity only looks at kind of the middle-ish area, middle tones or exposures. And it will increase almost like a micro contrast in just the middle exposure areas. And this will emphasize texture and detail as well. And it can increase apparent sharpness, but it can be very overdone, or you can go the other way and make things look very softened by reducing that contrast, but it can really destroy detail, or it can overdo detail, whereas the texture slider is a little smarter about it and doesn't quite destroy things as much. So clarity is something I will do very subtly, and I don't really do clarity on portraits too much because it can really mess with somebody's skin. Clarity used to be the way that you would kind of clean up somebody's skin if you wanted to smooth it, but the texture slider is a lot better nowadays. The dehaze slider does exactly what it says. It adds or removes haze or fog. So if you slide it to the right, you'll remove haze, and you slide it to the left to add haze. So it works really well if you have any kind of haziness in your photo, whether from UV light or actual fog or clouds in your photo. You can actually kind of remove it and bring some clarity back to your photo that way. And then the next section down is your vibrance and saturation. So I'm actually going to skip to saturation first. Saturation simply adjusts the saturation or intensity of all the colors in your photo equally. If you go to -100, it will take all the color out of your photo and you basically have a monochromatic picture. If you go all the way to +100, it doubles the intensity of your colors. So think of saturation like exposure, brightness, for your colors in a way. It's how bright does it make that green or that yellow or that red? Does it make it more green or does it make it less green until all the green's gone and it's just gray? So that's what saturation is. And saturation you have to be careful with, because saturation, just like exposure, is you could overexpose a color in a way. It's oversaturated. So you might have many shades of green that a pixel could be. But when I say that it's overexposed color-wise, you get to a point where it's just a bright green as that pixel can be. And if you have a whole bunch of pixels like that, you no longer have tonality, you no longer have detail. It's just all one shade of green or red or blue or whatever color. That's where vibrance comes into play, because it also adjusts the color saturation or the intensity, but it minimizes the clipping or the blowing out or overexposing of those colors. It tries to ignore all the ones that are already kind of too bright or heading towards oversaturation, and only changes the saturation on the lower saturated colors, so the colors that are already not quite that bright, so that it doesn't blow things out and you still retain some detail while still bringing a little bit more color out of your photo. It also tries to pay attention to the areas of color that include skin tones, so that you don't make somebody look too orange or it really overdoes the skin, whereas saturation can really not be very good on portraits sometimes, but it can be nice on landscapes if you're careful with it. Even that being said, with both of these sliders, you tend to want to do them very minimally. So I'm going to go back to Lightroom here, and let's just take a look at this photo here, and let's take a look at some of these. So if I go to my profile, so I'm going to keep it in color, and I'm going to go to my profiles first, remember, before we do anything else, and I'm going to change it to more of a vivid one, so you can kind of see the changes here. And if we go to vivid here and hit close, so it already made the colors a little more vivid. Now I can go and play around with these sliders. Remember, exposure is my overall brightness. So everything at once makes the whole thing brighter or darker. Contrast changes the difference between the highlights and the shadows. So if I go increased contrast, it makes the shadows darker and the brights brighter, which means it could actually blow things out a little bit more. If I reduce contrast, it brings the highlights darker and the shadows brighter. And that's why it doesn't look as sharp, because everything's a little bit closer brightness level to each other. I'll usually increase contrast a little bit. And in this one, we might be able to increase the exposure just a touch. And then we have our highlights and shadows, and highlights will just affect the brighter areas of our image. So if I bring those down, I can start to affect the sky a little bit, or maybe the lights. If I bring it up, I can really just blow those out. And shadows will affect the darker areas of our image. So we can bring our darker areas up, or we can bring them down. So remember, contrast is the difference between the highlights and shadows. So by playing with the highlights and shadows, we can also do the same thing that contrast is doing. Make sense? So you can kind of play with either one of those. But if you're just trying to bring the shadows up a little bit without affecting the highlights, that can be a nice way to bring some detail back into certain darker areas. And then we have our whites and our black clipping values. Now these I don't mess with too much, but if we have an area of white that's blown out, I might try bringing the highlights down a little bit first. And then you could also bring the highlights or the whites down to try and bring more detail out. If it's just too blown out, like in this picture, you're not going to be able to bring everything back. Let me show you in like this picture here. I'm going to reset it. So if I wanted to, I could bring the entire exposure down. Maybe that makes everything a little too dark. So maybe I'll start with just the highlights to try and bring this path a little bit more in line. I can bring just the highlights down. I'm going to bring them down all the way. And it's still a little too bright, so maybe I bring exposure a little bit down. And now I can also play with the shadows and bring those up a little bit too if I wanted to, but I'm actually pretty much okay with that. Maybe a little bit. And then you can play with your white. So if I wanted to bring the highlights or the brightest areas down a little bit more, I could, but I'm not going to worry about that. One thing I will play with is the black slider. So like I said, I don't care if some of the pixels go pure black, because they're still going to print okay. And sometimes I feel like it brings a little bit more contrast or detail back to the photo, because sometimes I might want to bring the shadows up so I can see a little bit more detail underneath something, but then it just looks too bright everywhere. So I can always bring the shadows or the blacks back down. And you see how it kind of brings some of that contrast back inside of like some of these leaves and everything? Okay. Another thing I like to show everybody on the histogram real quick is you see these two arrows in the top left and the top right. I'm going to reset this photo. The left arrow shows you clipped blacks or shadows. So if I click on that, it'll show me in blue anywhere that's clipped, which means pure black pixels. So if I drag this all the way down, all the area in blue is now blacked out, underexposed. Now, the one on the right is the opposite. This is your clipped highlights. So if I turn this one off and click on this one, now it shows me in red anything that's blown out, overexposed. So if I bring the exposure way up, it shows me everything that's blown out. So I can use that because I can know that my sky is not blown out at all. I have a little bit of clipped on the mountain and the path. So if I leave that on by clicking on it, and then I can drag the highlights down, and I can see that all that went away. Now I can there's still a little bit on the mountain, and I still think this looks a little too bright, so I can still kind of go here and bring that down a little bit until I got more detail there. But I still don't have any. I can click on here, and there's not really too many shadows that are clipped. Now I can bring the detail up a little bit in the shadows. Now watch what happens when I move the black slider. It will immediately start to clip things because it's affecting the clipping directly. So I can tell where my pure black pixels are. Now in this picture, I don't care. Those are underneath branches and things like that where I don't care if somebody sees detail. I want them to see this detail all up here and on the path and everything. Just make sure you click these off when you're done so you can kind of see what the photo actually looks like. Okay, any questions on that so far? I know we're a little bit over past noon. Everybody doing okay? Okay, so let's take a look at some other sliders real quick in here. So then we have the present section. So check texture, clarity, dehaze, vibrance, and saturation. So I'm going to kind of leave this here. I've kind of got the exposure a little bit more in line, and you can kind of watch the histogram here. I've got, remember, this is showing there are some clipped blacks. I'm okay with that in this case, but you'll see that line here on the edge here is showing this blacks area. There's a pure line on the left, which means they're clipped. Now, if we zoom in here and we take the texture slider, you can kind of see what that starts to do to the rocks. So you see the texture come out of the rocks and the leaves and everything more. If we look at it overall, you can kind of see how that affects the texture there. The texture slider, I think, does a really, really good job. Now we can drag it the other way and soften everything up, and it can really make things look soft. It takes a lot of the detail out. It's typically safer bet than the clarity tool, but you can still go a little too extreme with it, so I usually recommend going one way or the other, just a little bit, like I'm just going to do a little bit towards that side. Now, just to show you what clarity does, remember, it's just affecting these middle areas, mid-tone, so it won't affect the brighter or the darker areas too much, but it will add just what it says, kind of a clarity. It also almost like increases the texture. But I don't think it does quite as good a job as the texture tool. So if we reset that, you know, it's pretty similar. You could do both at once, but I kind of like how the texture tool does it. By the way, you can double click on the name of any one of these to reset it. So if I drag something and double click on the name, it resets it. Now this picture doesn't have a lot of haze, but if we use the dehaze tool, we can bring out, watch the sky, especially where the clouds are. See how it kind of cleans up some of the haze in the atmosphere? Or we can add a haziness to the whole photo. So it's kind of like your fog reduction tool or addition tool. And then vibrance and saturation. So this is already a pretty vibrant photo because we picked that profile. Well, actually we did that on the other one, but we could pick a more vivid profile, but this one's already pretty vivid. But if we take the saturation up, you can see what it does to all the colors. So if we go all the way, go extreme, it kind of looks a little cartoony, right? So these are all very, very green, very blue. You're gonna have a lot of greens or certain colors just kind of go to whatever their brightest green is. Not always, but it can be a little too heavy-handed. So I'll usually be very subtle, very little amounts with that. Vibrance is safer because it only tries to bring up the colors that aren't quite so vivid already. So if we can bring that up, then I feel like that doesn't get quite so cartoony so quickly. It can still overdo it too if you go crazy, but it's usually a little safer, especially with people. With a landscape like this, it's not as big a deal to use saturation, but the vibrance is usually a safer bet. Okay, any questions on that so far? Okay. We okay to cover one more section before we end off here? Everybody have time? I know we're running a little over time today. Okay. So the next thing is, let's go look at the detail section here, because this is where we get our sharpening and our noise reduction. So I'm going to go back to the slideshow real quick so we can cover some of these. So, like I said, it contains sharpening and noise reduction. And we'll especially look at sharpening here because most every raw file needs a little bit of sharpening applied. And honestly, Lightroom will already automatically have some sharpening that's applied to any raw file. So if you go to this panel, you'll probably already see a little bit of sharpening there. If it's a JPEG file, it might be set to 0 because your camera has usually already applied a little bit of sharpening to the photo from the raw data. The amount is real simple though. That's almost like your exposure slider. It affects sharpening across the entire image. It's the intensity of the sharpening from 0 all the way up. So the higher the number, the more sharpening. But you always have to be careful with these tools because if you go too high, too much sharpening will make it look noisier, will increase the apparent noise. And then you have a few other tools below it we'll cover real quick. I don't recommend playing with these too much all the time. A lot of times their default values are fine and you can just increase the amount a little bit. But the radius is the amount of sharpening applied to edges. And what this means, so both radius and detail apply to the types of edges sort of that Lightroom's looking at. Because remember, Lightroom is just software. It doesn't know what a picture actually looks like. It can't recognize a mountain or a person or things like that typically like we can. So it's looking at what it can detect as edges in a photo so it can sharpen those. It can kind of change the contrast along those edges to make them look sharper or along those pixels. So it's going to look at things like changes in color, like on this mountain here, like it's going to detect an edge here because there's an obvious difference in pixels between the edge of this mountain and the sky. It's not always perfect, but with radius and detail, you're basically controlling how it's translating some of those edges. So with radius, we're looking at actual pixels and how many pixels from an edge it's sharpening. So generally 1.5 is fine, but the number here, like on radius 1.0, means 1 pixel. So if we have an edge that was detected, it means it's going to sharpen about a width of 1 pixel along that edge. So if you went to 2, it's going to do 2 pixels, or 3 would be 3 pixels. If you go too high, that's why it makes your edges look kind of shadowy, because you're basically pushing that sharpening out a number of pixels away from that edge. So generally keep it at 1, maybe 1.5, very subtle on that. You most of the time don't have to change that one, and don't worry about it too much. The detail can be nice to play with sometimes because this helps Lightroom determine what size of edges to sharpen. You know, it's going to almost kind of filter out in a way which edges it can detect and which edges it's looking at to sharpen. And the detail helps determine that. So a smaller number will actually sharpen larger edges. So if you start dragging this up towards the right, it will start looking at smaller and smaller edges, which pronounces texture. So when it starts sharpening all the little smaller edges in there, then you get more detail. That's why it's called the detail slider. So if you have a whole bunch of little leaves and things like that, and it's not really sharpening in between the leaves or all the little tiny details or edges, then by dragging the detail slider to the right, you can help it sharpen those a little bit more. And then masking is kind of a way of telling Lightroom to sharpen the entire image completely or to ignore certain parts of it. And it kind of goes back to edges too. You're kind of, it almost goes hand in hand with the detail slider in a way, and I'll show you what I mean by this, because it starts taking away sharpening from flatter areas of the image and only starts sharpening the very edges of things. And I'll show you, you can actually visibly see this. And here's where I like to tell you about a little tip that comes in. If you hold down the Option key on a Mac or the Alt key on Windows while moving any of these sharpening sliders, and this works with other sliders in Lightroom too, it will actually kind of switch to a monochromatic kind of black and white view of your picture and give you a better view and idea of what it's doing while you're dragging these sliders. This is especially useful with the masking slider. So if I click on this masking slider and just drag it, you can't really see what it's doing too much. You might be able to see in this little preview up here, or if I zoom into the picture, it's not quite as sharp if I go all the way up, because if I go masking 100, it's basically not sharpening much of the picture. Now, if I hold down the Option key and I drag this slider, everything goes white, because that means white means it's an area of the picture that it is sharpening. So right now it's sharpening everything. So let me zoom back out. So everything goes white because it's telling us that everything in white is getting sharpened. Now if I drag this over, now we see some black. Everything in black is not getting sharpened. It's ignoring it. So as we drag the masking slider up, we can actually turn off sharpening in a lot of these other areas that are turning black, which are mostly flatter areas without as much detail anyways. So if we don't want it to sharpen something like the sky, you know, it might add more noise to the sky if we sharpen it too much. We want it to sharpen more of the smaller edges of things and other details. We can use the masking slider to literally determine which parts of our picture are actually getting sharpened. So that's something I'll use all the time, and just hold down Option or Alt so you can kind of see what that's doing. And you can do that with sharpening too. It won't give you that quite same view, but if we zoom in somewhere, here I'm going to go to the mountain, and we hold down Option or Alt, it goes to black and white, and it just helps us see. Can you see that there? It kind of helps you see the sharpening being applied. It's very subtle, but you can see the sharpening a little better. Now, I don't recommend messing with radius and detail too much, but if you do, definitely use the Option or the Alt key on Windows, because it will also let you see that better. So now you can really see what the detail slider is doing. So we'll bring out more tiny details. I don't recommend this on a portrait because it will really affect the skin, not usually in good ways. And radius too. So you can especially see it in radius there. You see that? Okay, so I'm just holding down the Option or the Alt key. Okay. So that's basically the sharpening thing. So the last thing I want to cover, if everybody's okay on time, a little bit more, is noise reduction real quick. Now noise reduction always plays against sharpening. Sometimes you use noise reduction because you have a really high ISO image that's very noisy from the camera. But if you increase sharpening too much, it will add an apparent noise to your picture as well. Noise reduction will also reduce the sharpening of your picture though, so you're always kind of playing against that. So you have to be careful with this and be very subtle with it. Even on a high ISO image, you usually don't want to go too high. It basically shows up in visible artifacts though. Has everybody seen noise? I can kind of skip past this part if you kind of know what noise is. It's usually going to be grayscale, kind of grainy look. Everybody seen that on a high ISO image?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So the main thing we're doing with noise most of the time is the luminance noise. You don't need to worry about the color noise too much. Most of us aren't going to see that too much, and if it's a raw file, most of the time Lightroom has already applied this a little bit and taken care of it. But luminance noise is what happens, grayscale noise is usually what happens with high ISO shots. And so simply by dragging the luminance slider up from 0, you're going to start reducing the noise. It's kind of blending the pixels together in a way to make them more uniform to get rid of those noisy pixels. It will soften your image, so you want to be very subtle with this. And if something's just really noisy, there's not a whole lot you're going to be able to do, but it might help a little bit. So it's just simply zoom in 100% to your picture, or look at that little preview there in the detail pane and slightly drag this up until it kind of gets a little cleaner. So then you do have a detail and a contrast slider here. And again, these are sliders I don't deal with too much, but it kind of controls, the detail slider controls your luminance noise threshold. Now what that means is for very noisy photos, you can preserve more detail as you're dragging the luminance slider up. So higher values will preserve that detail, but it means it won't be quite as effective. So you still get a little bit noisier results. But if you need to drag the luminance slider up a little bit and then try and bring a little detail back, then you can use the detail slider and move it to the right for a little higher value. Lower values, if you want to reduce the details but have a little cleaner results, then you can use the detail slider to the left. Most of the time I just use a luminance slider and you don't need to mess with details too much. They're all going to play against each other, so it's always very subtle amounts and you can easily kind of undo the other one. So then contrast controls the luminance contrast, and this is also again for very noisy photos. And higher values will help preserve contrast, because whenever you're cleaning up noise, it's kind of blending the luminance values of pictures next to each other a little bit together, so it can reduce contrast. So if you bring the contrast slider up, you can bring some of that back, but you could potentially get blotchy areas of noise now. So whereas lower values will produce smoother results, which is typically where you're going to leave it. So just so you kind of know what those do, most of the time I would just play with the luminance value. And then real quick, in case you ever need to play with it, and like I said, most of the time Lightroom applies this by default, so you don't need to worry about it. Color noise is something that can happen from a raw file as well. Usually it's more like splotchy colors in an area, and again, you're not going to usually see this because it's already applied a little bit. But if you see it, you can drag this up or down. If you take a raw file and drag this all the way down, you might be able to actually see it then if you want to see what that looks like. So, you also have detail and smoothness here too, and detail is very similar to the other one. It controls the noise threshold, so higher values will protect more detailed color edges, but may result in speckling, so this affects color more. Lower values will affect color speckles, but may result in, it will reduce color speckling, but might result in color bleeding. So I'd usually just leave this one kind of right in the middle, unless you literally are having color bleeding or speckling, and you need to play with that. Smoothness will help if you do have an area with mottled colors and you want to kind of smooth that area out and make it more of a uniform color. So again, leave those at default most of the time unless you really have a problem picture, which most of us aren't going to run into now most of the time. Let's see if I have a photo real quick. I don't think any of these are too noisy. This was ISO 1250, so It's not too bad. You will see noise more in darker areas, by the way. Brighter areas won't show noise as much as shadow areas. So you can see it a little bit more. I don't know if you can tell, but in the bike here, maybe if I go to 2:1, you see some of the noise in there. It's just not quite uniform. So if we go down to develop, you see that? Yeah. So if we bring the noise reduction up, you know, it's not going to be perfect, but it smooths it out a little bit. Okay, now we can go extreme, and now it's a lot smoother. Okay, it looks better. It also kind of just softens everything in the picture though. So, but it will merge those pixels together. So that's kind of extreme. I wouldn't normally go that high. Now, if we tried to then sharpen it again, look what happens. It just made it noisy again. So over sharpening can kind of cancel out your noise reduction, and over noise reducing can cancel out your sharpening. So there's only so much you can fix a picture, but it's something that to know about and to play with, especially if you're really high ISO, like 3200, stuff like that, and you want to reduce the noise a little bit. I might just bring it up like 10 or 15. I usually don't change that too much. And honestly, cameras nowadays handle noise quite a bit. So,
Chris?
Yeah.
I have a question about the sharpening.
Yeah.
Do you find yourself using the at least the amount sharpening fairly frequently as part of your flow of editing on a photo?
Honestly, I don't use it a whole lot because raw files, it almost always, Lightroom will apply this default here of 40 and then 1 in 25. So every once in a while I will, usually more on like a landscape image maybe than maybe a portrait. A lot of cameras nowadays too, if I've nailed focus, especially with like a portrait, I mean the detail is so much there I don't really need to sharpen a whole lot. And keep in mind, you can't really sharpen an out of focus picture if it's really out of focus. You might be able to bring a little detail back if it's slightly out of focus, but it's still not going to be perfect. I might once in a while. A lot of times what I will do if I'm going to do that though, is I will use the masking, because maybe I don't want it to affect like everything in his cheek, but I want it to affect the edges along like the nose and the face. So I can kind of bring the masking up until it's really only the edges. And then I can be a little heavier handed on some of the sharpening because it's taking it away from those middle areas. You know, it still affects it a little bit, but it helps. But I'm usually not going to be too much higher than 40 anyways. I might go to like 50. So it's something to play with per photo, especially like I said, like if we went back to like a landscape image like this one and I zoomed in, certain things might make more sense to do besides sharpening though, because maybe if I just, I'm also at 200%, which isn't usually good, but I might, you know, texture might do a better job than sharpening with, while it will give it an apparent sharpness, maybe even a little bit of clarity.
Yeah.
That's sometimes more effective. And then if I needed to, I could add a little bit of sharpening maybe, and then I can always mask it down. Now in a landscape image, I might play with radius a little bit and see if that makes it even sharper. Maybe detail, actually probably detail more than radius. You know, I could bring that up and you can kind of see that. And that makes everything a little bit sharper sometimes, but I also notice like in some of these areas that are, now these aren't always in focus because I focused on the mountain here, but it kind of added a little bit, it's hard to see, it might be harder for you guys, but I can see a little bit of noisier areas in it now too. So that's where detail can really accentuate that. So I'll usually play with it very subtly and then maybe mask it out just a touch. So, but play with your texture and your clarity slider depending on the picture more, and maybe even dehaze. Sometimes I won't even touch, I might bring a little texture up, and if I want that sky to look a little bit more blue, almost like using a polarizing filter, just by bringing the dehaze up a touch, you know, that can really help too. So always start with the basics panel and then very subtly. I won't use the sharpening as much as I might if I'm exporting a photo. So if you're exporting a photo and saving it for like printing or something like that, there's a little, let me see, where is that? Sharpening for output. And if you do screen or paper sharpening, that is to make up for the sharpening that's lost when you save a file out at a different size than the original. So if I'm printing it on paper too, it will lose sharpening or clarity when you print something because the paper soaks up some of the ink. So if you are saving or exporting a picture out specifically to get printed, I will usually change this to something that's close to the type of paper, like glossy paper, standard. And it's very subtle, but it will add a little bit of sharpening to that photo so that when you print it and the paper soaks up some of the ink, it kind of makes up for that. You can do that for screen too, but that really only matters if you're actually resizing the photo. If you're exporting it at the same resolution as the original photo, that's not really needed. But if I'm resizing it here down from like 24 megapixels to 4 megapixels, I'm reducing the size, you could potentially lose clarity. And so I can do a screen sharpening that tries to bring that back. It's very subtle, but I'll tend to do that more than I will the actual sharpening panel, but just so you know that it's there. Okay. Yeah. So that's pretty much it. If we had time, sometimes I get into some of the lens correction. Does anybody want to go over that? I know we're running really late. I'm going to send you the PDF file though too, so that will cover some of that if you want. Yeah, everybody have time? You want to go over this 5 more minutes?
Yes.
Okay. So lens correction is pretty simple.
If you are.
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. So I just want to make sure if anybody needed to go. So lens correction is pretty simple, and you don't always need this either, because sometimes it is built in. And let me see if I have a Fuji. Certain cameras build it in. Okay, so see this picture here? It says built-in lens profile applied. That means if you ever see that, you don't need to do anything here. That means that your camera already builds in a lens profile correction, and Lightroom picks that up. Lightroom's compatible with that. So it's already fixed your image. It's already pulled that from the camera. But the reason this is here is because typically a RAW file won't have that built in, and maybe a wide angle lens has some distortion, and you want to be able to correct that. And that's where the profile corrections come in. And not just distortion. You might also have things like chromatic aberration, which is your green or purple fringing sometimes. So if you are shooting especially a backlit subject, and I don't really think I have anything that shows it here. Let me see. I don't think it's going to have anything, but you might see a little green fringe along the edge of something where the sun is hitting it, or you might have a purple fringing. That's chromatic aberration. So simply by clicking this button, it will most of the time automatically take that out of the picture. So that's usually one that I'll just kind of click. It doesn't really hurt anything. I don't think this one really has it too much either. It really depends on your lens. Some lenses will exhibit this more than others. It's kind of a lens, I wouldn't say defect, but some lenses just aren't as good at handling that depending on their construction. So that's fine to click, even if you have a built-in lens profile applied. That will tend to get rid of some of the fringing. Now, if you don't have a built-in lens profile applied like this picture here, so we'll go back to this one, then you can simply enable profile corrections, and it should detect which camera and which lens you used. But make sure and double check that it picked the right one, because if it doesn't have a profile, it really depends on if Adobe has built a profile for that lens. If Adobe, so this was a 24-70 Nikon, so it did that right. Now it's very subtle, but if you watch the picture, you can kind of see it change a little bit. And it does a few things. It gets rid of some of the lens distortion, but it also gets rid of dark corners or vignetting caused by your lens. A lot of lenses, especially wide open at 2.8 or 1.8, might have a little bit of dark corners vignetting. So it just brightens those up based on that lens. So it's a real automatic thing. If you just check that, it should find it. Make sure it found the right one, or sometimes it might just say nothing found. Unfortunately, if it doesn't have a profile for your lens, there's nothing you can do there. And then you have to manually correct the lens if you want to correct it. And you can override it a little bit, so I can change the vignetting correction if I want, or I can even change the distortion a little bit here. So you can see it bow in or out a little bit. But most of the time, if it has a profile, just leave that. Now, if it doesn't have a profile, then you just want to uncheck that and go over to manual. And the main thing you're going to want to do in manual is distortion here. And you can literally just drag the distortion up and down, and you can really go crazy with the picture. So it's going to be very subtle. But let's see if I have one with like a wide angle lens. So this one, I believe, was 18 millimeters. Now it's not too distorted. This one might actually have So if I had a really wide angle lens and I wanted to very slightly change the distortion, you can play with that there. Now, if it's extreme enough where you get this, so we've got some white edges here because we actually pushed the image in past the original frame. Now I could go up to the crop tool and I could crop it in to get rid of that. But we have this little button that says constrain crop, and that basically automatically crops the image for us as we change the distortion. So if I click that, it crops it in for us. So now if I change the distortion, it's going to crop it in. Now the only problem with constrain crop is it doesn't crop it back out, even if we uncheck it. So if you want to reset it, you have to go back to the crop tool, and you can see it cropped in, and hit reset. So, but if you are cropping or using distortion this way, then constrain crop is an easy way to automatically crop it in for you. Just remember, you might need to go reset it if you decide that you're not going to use that. So, and then you do have the other two items that the automatic profiles typically do. So defringe is your remove chromatic aberration. So you have the automatic one, which usually this one works no matter what. But if you still have some green or purple, then you can actually control where that purple hue or that green hue lies, how much green is in there, and how much of the amount. So, and if you had some in there, you could actually click on this dropper and click on that green or purple fringe, and it would set these sliders for that color. So that's another way to do that. But you do have to be careful, because you could accidentally set too great a range, and it will take out some of the colors in your photo. So some of the colors you might want. So if you need to manually correct that, though, that one I usually don't recommend messing with too much, because the automatic remove usually works. And then the last one is vignetting. So you can actually play with the vignetting yourself, and you can change the midpoint as well. So if it's not fixing the vignetting properly for you, then you can do that there. Okay, but most of the time, hopefully, it'll have a profile that will pop up. So, like example, in this case, it doesn't. And let me look at the, I don't remember which lens I used on this one. Let's go to the exposure info. There we go. Yeah, so this was a Tamron lens. I remember this lens. And this lens had no profile. It has no profile that Adobe makes, and it's not one that's built into the camera, so you would have to manually do it. It's not that distorted here, so I'm not worried about it. But that's something you can run into. So if you click this and it says none, or it might just go to something completely wrong. It might detect your camera as a Nikon and go to Nikon and go to something similar. You know, if it sees I had like an 18 to 270, maybe it thinks I've got like a Nikon 18 to 200 on there, and it picks the wrong one, and it does some distortion control on it. So you want to really make sure and watch what it did, and just turn that off if it doesn't have something for it. So.
Chris, I notice kind of frequently that I used to have a Coolpix P510, and it comes up as a P6000, I think.
Okay.
And I don't know why it does that. And now I have a Z6 with 2470 lens, and I can't find it.
Yeah, it probably doesn't have the Z series in there yet, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I couldn't find the camera or the...
Yeah, it just means that unfortunately Adobe hasn't built a profile, so you can't really use the profile correction right now. Now, JPEG files, most of the cameras like Nikon and Canon, if you're using a Nikon or Canon lens, it will recognize that lens and it will build any correction into that JPEG. It's just the raw files that it usually can't build it into from the camera, except for certain cases like some of the Fuji or certain ones that Lightroom will detect. So that's when you would use this. But yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't have every camera or every lens in there. So I usually just kind of click it, and if it finds it right, if not, then I'll turn it off. And you can always look at the list. So I go down here. It's got a few of the Coolpix, but like you said, it doesn't really have the right one. And we're looking at all the lenses. These are all the more like the G series and Nikon 1 lenses. Yeah, I'm not seeing any of the S lenses or the Z series lenses, the new ones yet. So Adobe will get there eventually, but it does take a lot of work on their part because they have to actually test the lens, look at the distortion, figure out the best corrections and vignetting corrections for it and any chromatic aberration it might have. And then they have to write that profile and then update Lightroom. So sometimes it can take a while.
So is it best for me to not click that one then, just do the first?
Yeah, just do the chromatic, but don't do the second one because you don't want to be applying the wrong profile correction from a different lens because it could be applying distortion and vignetting control that has nothing to do with your lens.
Okay.
So if you are seeing distortion on that, then I would go to manual and just play with the distortion here a little bit. Otherwise, I wouldn't worry about it. A lot of lenses, especially newer ones, can be pretty corrected nowadays, and you might not see that much distortion anyways. The main place I see a lot of distortion is on a really wide angle, like on a full frame, like a 16 to 35, you know, or on a crop sensor, maybe like a 10 to 22 or something like that. So, but otherwise I wouldn't worry about it. But just so you know it's there, the biggest thing I'll usually check is remove chromatic aberration on most of my pictures. So. All right, cool. Well, that's pretty much it. Like I said, I'll send you the PDF, so if there's anything else in there, I think we pretty much covered everything that was in there in all the basics panels. So definitely play with the basics panel, play with the crop tool, play with the color profiles in here that you might have, because you might find you like one of the ones that's built in from your camera. I do play with those all the time, and start with that. And then remember snapshots and presets. So remember, if we have all these settings changed here and we kind of like how these look on this picture, we can simply go and say create preset, and I can call this like landscape 01. And then you want to make sure and check all the different check boxes for any of the sliders that you want to save to that preset, or just do all of them. The only one you might not want to save to your preset might be the calibration, because maybe you're using a different lens on different ones. Or you might not want to do lens, well, calibration might be okay, but you don't want to do the lens correction or transform. And you probably don't want to do, let me see, I would usually probably turn off white balance because that might be something that's different per picture. Just anything that you want, especially the basic tonality. And then if I hit create, I now have that preset over here on the left hand side under user presets. Now if I click on a different picture and I go to that preset, it will assign that preset to that picture. Now, it might not work for every picture because it's just those settings from the first picture I did. So it works better sometimes in certain cases if you have some more general settings that maybe don't affect the overall exposure and stuff like that. Like this one doesn't need to be underexposed. You can always reset from there. And then you also have your history too and your snapshot. So let's go back to this one. So let's say I like how this one is. I can go to a snapshot and I can call this like color version 1. Create, and it gives me a snapshot over here. Now let's say I wanted to make a black and white version, and you know I'm going to reset it, make it black and white, and maybe for black and white I want it much more contrasty. We'll still reduce the exposure and the highlights a little bit to bring back some detail, but maybe I want the blacks darker, the whites a little brighter, and a little dehaze, but I want it to be real contrasty black and white. Yeah, maybe we can bring the exposure up just a touch, something like that. Okay. Now I can go to snapshots and call one monochrome version 1 and create. Now I can go over here and I can go back to my color version, or I can go click on go back to my black and white version. It's going to change those sliders each time, so you kind of have to click on each one. Now remember, these are only on this photo, unlike presets. So that preset landscape 01 shows up if I click on another photo. I still have the presets, but all those snapshots are gone because those are per individual photo. So if I go back to this one, I still have those two versions, you could kind of say. Okay, now you can just put your mouse over each one and look at the little navigator window. It'll kind of show you up there what it looks like. Make sense? Any questions on that? Cool. All right, well that's pretty much it for that class. So make sure and hit me up, email me if you have any questions, play with your photos, play with these sliders. Remember, you can always click reset here in the bottom right on your develop. And then I will also look up that question earlier on resetting a bunch of photos, clearing the history on that too, and I'll let you guys know via email as well if that's possible. So, yeah.
Chris, before we go real quick, I do have one question, and it doesn't really have to do with the sliders, but
yeah,
let's say the photo that you we're gonna have to make a leap here. But let's say this photo that you have showing number 5
Mhm.
and number 6 were basically the same photo, but you have different kind of edits
Yeah.
done, number 5 and number 6, and you're not sure. I mean, the photo is actually a different photo too, but you're not sure which you like better, your 5 or your 6. How do you go about posting them so you can see them side by side again, and then how do you undo that? Because I did it once and I got so lost I couldn't figure out how to change it again.
Okay, so it does have a comparison view. So it's this one right next to it here, the RA, the reference view. So you kind of have to select, so let's say we had this photo. I could select both of them using Shift or Control Command. And then if I
Right.
click on this, it'll show them side by side, or you can drag and drop actually. Why is it not?
Wait, what did you just do?
There we go.
Okay, I mean, now, what did you do? I
So
don't even.
this is not quite the same as a comparison view. That's actually a little bit more in the library module. So if we go to G,
Oh, is that where you do it?
if you want to do more of a comparison. So if we select both of these photos, and then I go down here to X and Y,
Okay.
it will show me the two photos side by side.
Okay.
And then I can kind of see them both together. And I can zoom in, it'll zoom into the same spot. So this really, it works a little better if you have two of the same exact photo.
What if it's like I said, there are two photos, but you edited them just slightly different. You can't tell. You know, they're a sunset. Let's say it's the same sunset. You just edited them a little differently. The number 5 photo and the number 6 photo, but you want to see them together.
So if we do this view, reference and active, I have my reference photo now on the left-hand side. And now I can actively edit the right-hand photo so I can try and make it match.
Oh, so the reference photo was the one that you clicked on. And then how did you get the other one up?
So actually the reference photo is the one that I dragged up there. So let me go back to, so you click on the photo you want to edit. So let's say I want to edit this one. And then I click on reference view. Now it's already there, but you basically just drag the photo up that you want to be the reference. So if I wanted to see this one, I could put that one there.
Okay.
Or I could put this one there. And that one's not going to be affected as I'm editing. It's only editing the one on the right, the active one. And then I can use the reference one to kind of see it.
Okay. And what is why then?
So that's more of a before and after. That's a little different. Maybe that's a little bit more what you're thinking of. Like if I click this one, so this one more shows me my before and after. It kind of shows me what the picture originally looked like, and then it shows me everything I've done to it.
Oh.
So it's not really showing me two different pictures. It just gives me a reference in a way of what I've changed. It's not going to change. The before picture is always going to be the original file or kind of where it was at.
Okay, that's not. Okay.
Yeah.
And to undo that, when you do one of them and you want to undo it, how do you just undo it?
So you would just click back on this little bottom left one or the loop view. And that'll take you back to your regular view.
Okay. All right. I can play with that a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Now Lightroom kind of has a selecting candidate view too. That's a little bit more for zooming in. That works a little better if you've got two similar photos and you want to zoom in on the same place and kind of compare the same areas, things like that sometimes.
Oh. Okay.
So that's your compare view. So there's a few other views in there too that gets a little bit more. But I'll show you one thing real quick. If you did have a bunch of edits on one photo and you wanted to synchronize them, in the library view I can click on the photo I edited, I can select another photo and go and do sync settings, and you can pick all the settings you want to copy to another photo or a whole bunch of photos.
Oh. Okay.
So that's another way that you could kind of synchronize settings too. So,
All right.
cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. No problem. Yeah, let me know how it goes. Make sure and email me any questions or anything that comes up while you're doing this. And then remember, next week we're going to do a little bit more advanced editing, and we're going to talk about a lot more of these tools up here, like the brush and the gradient and the spot removal tools. So, and we'll get into some of the things like the HSL and some of the different hue, saturation, and luminance sliders. So you can play with individual stuff.
One I don't get.
Yeah, and it's not something I use all the time, but it lets you target specific areas or specific colors in a picture a little bit more. So, but cool.
Thanks for your help, Chris.
Of course, anytime. Thank you everybody for coming. Everybody have a good day, and we'll be in touch.